Welcome back to It's a Mimic, where you never know what you're going to get. Today, we're launching into a new mini-series on Drow in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I'm Megan, and I'm lurking through the Underdark with both Casey and Ehlwyn. And today, we'll uncover the truths about Drow.
With everything changing as D&D 5th edition gets the 2024 updates, it's important that we don't lose any lore or details that previous editions had to offer. However, even as we pour over everything Drow from 5th edition, it's also important to understand the problematic nature of some of the Drow history. So make sure you listen to episode 0 of the series and keep that in mind.
In this episode, this panel of Dungeon Masters is going to start with the basics of what you need to know about Dark Elves and their societies before we discuss some of their minions.
All right, so let's do it. So we're going to dig into a lot of lore today, so buckle up. Here we go. All right, so let's dive right into Drow and a little bit about elves along the way, and kind of how they came to be. We do cover quite a bit of this lore with our episode 0 of Drow with Miek and Adam, who gracefully put that together, but I'm going to fill in some gaps, and then we'll chat about some neat ways on how to use them within your campaigns. Most of this lore can be found in the book Mordenkainen's Tomb and Foes. I know that people pronounce that word many different ways, but that's how I'm going to pronounce it today. So anyone who knows elves knows that they were birthed from the god Corellon, and that a great battle between him and Grumsh ensued, and from the blood that was spilt by Corellon, the elves were born. If you don't know that, that's a thing. But from that, they built the kingdom of Arvindor. But this is not about elves. This podcast is about the Drow. So let's focus on them, and it all starts with Lolth. Lolth was one of the elf gods that was created by Corellon, but she believed that their species could rise to greater heights if they all take advantage of their powers and become more individually powerful, and yet together, if that makes sense. Like, she wanted all of the elves to rise above together, but she wanted to encourage all of the other elf gods to use their specific abilities. Basically, like, use your individuality, have some freedom from Corellon, and then we could rise up and be better, right? As more of the Sire gods became their own person through this, a lot of the elf gods now saw Lolth as kind of like their mother, who brought them their freedoms, and then looked at Corellon as their father who sired them. So it was this whole mom and dad fighting scenario that was going on here. Lolth, however, took her own destiny in her hands and decided to strike out and attempt to off Corellon, and thus a great rift with the elves was formed. Those who supported Corellon, who survived Lolth's attack, and those who stood strong behind Lolth. So that's kind of where the rift was. Corellon stayed in Arvindor, and his basically what we call disciples, I guess, but they're called the Saladrin. And Lolth was banished to the Abyss, or the Underdark, where her disciples were now referred to as the Saladrin's Dark Reflection. So there's that light versus dark situation happening right at the beginning there. It is important to note that Corellon banished almost anyone who defied him. So also elves that still followed Corellon, but kind of defied him, and the Drow both ended up on the plains. But those that follow Lolth are within the Shadowfell and are called the Drow, etc., etc. But since the Feywild was kind of the first landing place for most elves as a whole, that would be why elves feel that strange pull to the Fey, and that's why they're kind of attached to the Fey realms. Even though their wanderlust caused them to branch out into other worlds, which is why we now see elves all over the plains in existence, is because they are kind of born with a natural wanderlust to travel around. I also want to make sure that I point out that even though the gods went their separate ways and some form of peace was returned to Arvindor, the rift between the Drow and the elves was not mended at all. Like, there's still a lot of tension between the Dark Elves and the elves. In fact, when an elf dies, it is said that they're supposed to be reborn in Arvindor. However, those that defied Corellon, be it the elves or the Drow, their souls are kept from the material plane by the Saladrin, and then kept to kind of like wallow alone for a period of time, so they could basically sit and think about what they did. So it's like
that's punished even after death.
Correct. Yeah. So I think it reemphasizes the fact that all this war happened and the segregation happened, but it didn't fix anything. Like, it just made things worse. So, but yeah, that is the basic how Drow came to be, and a little bit of how elves came to be, and why there is such a big rift and divide between the two. So let's start off by rolling some dice, and then I've got a question to ask.
I rolled a 10.
I rolled a 12.
I also rolled a 12.
Amazing. Reroll, Casey. 9.
I have an 18. That's
Nice.
the highest roll I've rolled in many, many an episode.
I'm very proud of you. All right, so keeping that lore in mind, what's one piece of lore that stands out to you as being ripe for campaign inspiration?
Well, I think like it would be really cool to run a campaign during this time where people are picking their sides, and ultimately in the end, because both the Drow and those that Corellon banished all end up in the Underdark. That seems like a perfect intro to a campaign or a one shot. Say like at the start is that you're all together and you're running a campaign with just elves, and you pick whether you're going to be a drow or something else, another kind of elf. And then the beginning is that you end up all falling down into the Underdark. And so it's a mix of both drow, whoever picked to be a drow, and whoever picked to be one of the other types of elves. But then your campaign is seeking how to navigate this aftermath of the war. I think that could be a cool place to start.
Yeah.
Because this is all brand new lore, honestly, to what like 5th edition might include, which we'll get into later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, I would like to, I think a good campaign to do with, like, if people like doing courts or political campaigns, actually playing out what that court would look like, of like the banishment of Lolth, and like actually having a court of deciding what to do between the Saladrin, and then the deciding of who stays, who goes, like all that piece, right? Again, that would be just more of that political intrigue one, so it feels more like a one shot or something. But to your point, I really like the idea of doing a long standing campaign of what it looked like to build the cities, because they're like, it is said they have some of the most beautiful cities. Like they spent time crafting and making sure that their cities were of like the highest, because their society is very true to wanting to feel like they are the best, the number one species, right? They have that kind of ingrained in their being. So everything is done well and everything is done perfect, right? So their cities are thought to be really gorgeous. So having that process of what building that environment and what building their city would look like, right? That would be a little bit fun. What about you, Ehlwyn?
I was honestly thinking the same thing as you guys. It was the political intrigue of it, but it's just more kind of like the aftermath. I was thinking like aftermath on the surface of like what that looked like, because was a pretty big battle between Corellon and Lolth. So it's like, what does that look like? How did that change the landscape of the surface and society, and what everybody kind of knew to be the norm, and how do you navigate that post kind of this rift, because there's going to be families that are fractured, there's going to be friends and villages and cities and things like that are there's mass amounts of loss. So just kind of essentially, what does that aftermath look like?
Yeah, or even like in like a household of elves, like elves and
Yeah.
that are living in the Fae.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting because they were also banished to the
Yeah.
plains, even though but they aren't necessarily Drow.
Yeah.
So seeing what a colony of those kinds of elves would look like in terms of
Yeah.
like, we are actually still in support of Lolth, but we just live in the Feywild, or so on and so forth, right? So
Yeah.
but lots of opportunity. All right, well, that being said, let's move on into some basics here.
So the lore in the monster manual is actually quite different. It relays a very brief but very different story of kind of the origins of how the Drow came to be in Lolth. There are only 2 pages dedicated to describing the Drow lore in the monster manual. It very much focuses on, of course, an ancient elven war, but it's between the good, the kind and charitable, and evil, the cruel and selfish. And of course, the war ends when the good banishes their evil kin, i.e. the Dark Elves, i.e. the Drow, underground, which then it becomes what we know as the Underdark. But it is only at this point that they meet Lolth and become the children of Lolth and begin building their life again under her worship, but also under solely her command. So I interpret this as Drow actually only coming to be once they are banished underground, and then living underground, evolution. They become accustomed to living without sunlight, and that there's physical changes, and then their abilities morph as well. and it's under the influence of Lolth, especially. So whether you believe that she kind of saved them and gave them some direction so that they could build their own civilization and salvation, an empire underground, TBD whether it was a true dictatorship or if they saw her as an opportunity to give them power and magic and build something else. So that's interesting.
Yeah, because it is said that in a couple of different versions of the lore that she was very about having people use their own abilities, like and find their true and own strength, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the beauty of like lost old histories, is that one part you can take on it is that she was a savior, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like gave the elves an opportunity to be their best selves, right?
Yeah.
So.
And yeah, and just with the spin that she is the all commander of all of them.
Somebody has to be in control. So.
The book describes the Drow as wicked, always plotting to take their revenge on the elves that banished them, even tens of thousands of years later. But because they build another empire in the subterranean depths, they see themselves as like rulers there, and they don't really take that label as exiles anymore. They will go up to the surface, but really only at Lolth's command. And being in the depths, they develop dark vision, and they can really no longer stand sunlight. They are also said to have slaves and will go to the surface at nighttime to capture more and bring them down. They use these slaves to build an empire and large cities of caverns, and they learn how to sculpt the stone. And the cities have elven features, but are protected by really high walls with giant spiders for guards. And I really love the imagery of they describe as webbing coating most of the stone surfaces to not only catch intruders, but have that signal to the giant spider guards. And they also hang swaths of webbing above the city to even catch airborne intruders coming in. So like fortress to the nines.
And ew. I have to say it. Ew. But so cool.
The Monster Manual also briefly describes how the Drow's magic evolves and adapts in their new life underground. But yes, remains susceptible to sunlight in that the magic will fade if they are on the surface in direct sunlight. They can craft using adamantine, which is a dark and supernaturally hard metal, and imbue them with magical properties. They can make new magic items, weapons, and armor with enhanced magical properties as well. And most of these are beautifully carved with spiders or webbing etched into it. And they are also able to summon demons from the abyss with their magic. The spellcasters are described as arrogant and will use their magic in any hateful way. Again, it's just interesting. They are true evil, but yet they are just building their own civilization. They don't really want to interact with any other species, and they're just protecting themselves. So it's really interesting. I could clearly see that the drive towards honing in that they are evil in the Monster Manual.
It's constant. Yeah.
And it's not just like dark, it's evil. Like they're like not necessarily focusing on light versus dark, it's good versus evil in the book.
Yeah.
And with such a connection to spiders and underdark vegetation, poisons are a common tool with the Drow through toxins and weapon blades and arrowheads being coated, typically with venom, for advantage in battle. They also highlight that Drow will work together to defeat a common foe, but are very poor allies. And that their society is hierarchical, with noble houses ruled by matrons, always seeking more power. Middle and lower classes have typically sworn fealty to one of the noble family houses, and the lowest of the low are slaves, and those could be Drow or other species that they have captured. Lolth dictates the societal rule through her priestesses and will punish all who disobey her command. I think this is pretty consistent through the lore. Males are below females, and while they can be assigned to do any role, they will always report to a female drow, will never become priests or rule a house. So that's the lore that is provided in the Monster Manual, which is ultimately what the Wizard of the Coast determined as the most important pieces of information to include. But yeah, like we've alluded to, it paints a very specific picture for new or inexperienced players if this is all the information that they have. It's really enlightening to also know all of the information that Megan covered. That's just above and beyond what's written here in 2 pages.
And the how we got here,
Yeah.
like.
Okay, so the Drow are included as one of the optional elf sub-races in the player's handbook. There are 3 sub-races: High Elf, Wood Elf, and Dark Elf, the Drow. And you must choose one of these when you're building your elf. So as an elf, you have a number of natural abilities, which include the following traits. Your skin is normal human color with hair of green or blue, and then it can vary depending on the sub-races. You have a dex score increase of 2. You can live to be 750 years old and reach adulthood at the age of 100, though they reach physical maturity at the same rate as humans. You have a slender build from under 5 feet to over 6 feet tall, and you're medium sized, and you have dark vision of 60 feet. You're proficient in perception, and you have advantage on saving throws against being charmed, and magic can't put you to sleep due to the Fae ancestry. And you do not need to sleep. You can trance or meditate deeply for 4 hours to gain the equivalent of 8 hours of sleep. Drow or Dark Elves, elf subrace, defines your elf to have stark white hair and whitish skin with blue hues, and your abilities are connected to the Underdark. The book mentions that Lolth, the Queen of Spiders, has corrupted some of the old Drow cities using the term cult, and in some other realms, the Drow have escaped this influence and seek to stand against it. Those Drow are known as heroes. So we get even this other spin of this is the first hint of Drow actually going against Lolth, and then there's that as well, lurking about in different realms of the Underdark. If you choose this subrace, it adds the following traits. Your charisma score is increased by 1. Your dark vision doubles to 120 feet. You are sensitive to sunlight, and you have disadvantage on attack and wisdom perception checks that rely on sight when you or the target or the object you're trying to see is in direct sunlight. You have Drow magic that allows you to know the cantrip Dancing Lights. And at 3rd level, you can cast Fairy Fire once per long rest. And at 5th level, you can cast Darkness once per long rest. Charisma is your spell casting ability for the Drow magic spells. And you have Drow weapon training, so you are proficient with rapiers, short swords, and hand crossbows. And that is the additions for the Drow Dark Elf in the player's handbook. It doesn't go into, again, any of the lore really that's in the Monster Manual. It kind of gives you another little spin talking about cults, which is an interesting thing. And it, of course, is, again, different from what Megan covered at the start.
Yeah, I feel like they're almost forcing your hand to believe that the darkness does come from being a cult, because if you use Lolth, say, as a warlock patron, right? Yeah. You're going to have a very specific picture painted of what that's going to look like. And I think that's the reason why they picked to just we're going to go evil and we're going to stay evil. But I feel like that's and actually here, let's roll some dice and I'll ask some questions, because I believe we all have some thoughts here.
Roll 13.
17.
4.
Amazing. So the first question is, what is one detail about the Drow that you'd be interested in role-playing as a player? And this kind of ties right into what I was just about to talk about, in terms of, I like the idea that there would be within one of these cities, whether it's one of the churches or one of the places of worship towards Lolth, where the history of Drow is painted on the walls, right? I'm thinking Sistine Chapel type shit, right? But it would be the history of her being that sovereign that brought the elves together and just wanted to carve out a safe space for her people. And then all of her everything about her history does, in my mind, bode for making her feel like everyone around her is untrustworthy. And that is where, and so like her like evilness just comes from a place of like her concern for being overthrown at some point, because she herself tried to overthrow Corlon at one point. So she kind of has that same nervousness, right? So she just has to keep checks and balances for her people to make sure that like she can stay in power and those kinds of things, right? So it would be interesting if you're playing a drow to know this history and then go into a group and play in a campaign. I think the hard part of playing drow in a campaign is because of their sunlight sensitivities. We've talked about this in so many episodes when we were doing the undead. Having a player at your party that has these sensitivities would be a very hard thing to navigate. So if I was going to play a drow, it would usually be like we are playing in the Underdark, or I would determine that their abilities don't defer them from being able to walk around in the daylight, that kind of thing, right? Or give them a parasail, and then they're in a good place. But I digress. I think that the role playing of a drow is going to come from me wanting to understand that history a little bit more so that I can play it accurately and almost choose a side. Like, do I believe Wolf is a sovereign, or do I believe that she's a dictator, right? Like, which side am I going to play? And I think that that's going to kind of determine what your character does going forward. So that's something to really kind of look into if you're going to want to play a drow. But what about you, Ehlwyn?
Yeah, so I think one of the more interesting parts of it is kind of playing one of those heroes and playing one of those ones that we had kind of talked about how either at the start of the campaign or a one shot, it's all about kind of that divide and the drow going into the Underdark and kind of establishing those cities and things like that. But then, as society evolved and was built and, kind of reinforced and things like that, you have these kind of like factions of people are the heroes that have kind of gone against Lolth. And what does that look like? So it's just kind of that, because they're going to be the ones that like there's going to be some sort of like major plot point that they're going to be running after, whether that's trying to take down a specific house that is currently top in power, or kind of going against Lolth, and she could be after him, or after that character and things like that. So I think it gives a lot of really good rich backstory for a player, as well as giving a lot of really good kind of plot points that you can touch on throughout a campaign, or that a DM could build off of throughout a campaign.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm going to build off both of your thoughts and inspirations.
Throw down, Casey.
Imagine, like, because the war happened tens of thousands of years ago. So, like, many generations as well of, like, drow have come, and many have gone as well. So imagine that you were in one of these civilizations that had escaped the influence of Lolth, and that original lore has just disappeared. And so you are known as say you are a spellcaster, and you're this arrogant hero drow that does not follow Lolth. Lolth is just like horrible, and was not brought salvation. And say you're tasked to go to the surface to do something, one thing or another, and you end up becoming part of a party that's going to do something else, and you have this like from birth this drive, like your history, this is what it was, and you are sharing that with your party members. This is what we know. And the party members are like, okay, like good on you for escaping Lolth's influence and being who you are. And then along the campaign, this is going to be maybe a longer term campaign, you come across one of those religious centers that have all of those carvings, Megan. And they're like, wait, what is this? What the hell is going on? And so through the campaign, you see them actually evolve. And it also gives, like, as a DM, you get the opportunity to tell much more lore and the alternate story of Lolth being the like salvation for these elves that were banished. And that character gets to also evolve, and maybe like their perception just changes, and they actually become a follower of Lolth. And you could have then meet Lolth and, do all that.
Take a level in
Little meet
Warlock.
cute.
Oh yeah, totally taking a level in Warlock.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
But man, that would be a pretty amazing story arc for one of your characters. Whether the character truly knew all of that, like all of the alternate lore histories, or they were just looking in the book and they're like, you know what, I'm going to be one of these heroes that like didn't fall for the cult and escaped, blah blah blah. And that's their starting point. As a DM, you then get to carve out, hey, you actually could have a whole different history and you may have been misguided in your 150 years of life or however old you're going to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love that.
Well, I mean, that kind of leads right into the next question because you kind of answered it a little bit, but like, what is a detail that you would use with the Drow that's interested in exploring as a DM, running them as NPCs? And I think that is some of the tough stuff that I mentioned before was if you now have a group of folks that are sensitive to sunlight and don't want to be above ground. So that's going to be a hard thing to kind of navigate. So it's going to be a very Drow heavy campaign, I find. Or it's going to be in one where like walking around in darkness or during the cover of night is more of a natural stance. So but I think that the interesting thing to explore is that history and what if my players don't know a lot of that history, adding that in small sprinkles, the way that you're saying, Casey, right? Like, and then they as NPCs can determine what way they want to sway either way, right? So it's almost like an experiment on how people are going to respond to that history, right? Like not only the character, but like the player as well, right? So they hear that history and they kind of think and go through their minds of how their Drow character would respond to hearing and understanding this new lore, and then how they decide to move their character forward one way or the other, right? Whether they are going to choose to now look at Lolth as a sovereign or if they're now going to look at her as worse than before, right? So, because they're probably going to grow up being told one thing by their parents and it becomes generational, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or maybe their parents or one of their, someone from their household got banished because they ended up going against Lolth in some way, right? Because there is this whole thing with Lolth where she will test her people to see if they're still loyal. And if they're not loyal anymore, she banishes them and turns them into driders, right? Like it's her way of, in my mind, protecting herself and protecting her society is banishing anyone that goes against her, right? So using that in the history and the lore too might be a good kickoff for a good storyline for one of your NPCs of how their character either leaves the Underdark or what's keeping them in the Underdark. So that'll be something that I want to keep in mind if I'm DMing it. So what about you, Ellie?
I was just thinking, like, because the monster manual goes like so deep into like the divide between good and evil, and like it is cut and dry for them. Cultists, like, there's going to be a lot of cultists in this. There's going to be a lot of cultists in the Underdark. There's going to be a lot of cultists in in these Drow cities. And so, what does that look like? What do kind of building up the houses with the matron mothers and the priestesses, and then just kind of like their followers and things like that. I think that there's a lot of, interesting aspects to it because we don't commonly see, matron hierarchies. And so kind of exploring that is, I don't know, is an interesting aspect, especially for if you have a party where they don't know a lot of the history of the Drow, and maybe it's not necessarily a Drow heavy campaign that you guys are doing, but they do venture into the Underdark, and this is their first kind of foray into learning about Drow, and interacting with them. What is that going to look like?
Yeah, especially if you have
As
male Drow at the table, right?
yes,
What that dynamic is going to look like.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, like if you have a male Drow party player and they don't know, like they are like one of the heroes, maybe they do live on the surface, they don't know a lot, to kind of Casey's point, like they don't know a lot about their backstory and they go to the Underdark for the first time and they're experiencing this for the first time. What does that look like? So I think that there's a lot of different layers that you can definitely put in there. There's either going to be like, they're going to recognize, party character's house name. And maybe it once used to be like one of the highest households. but that household fell. And kind of through the generations, like their history is kind of just whispers on the wind type thing, or they could just be like, who are you and
Mhm.
why are you here? And just like completely like, yeah, I think that there's a lot of different layers that you could do with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I like that you can spin it either way, because it also, talking about male drow, it was also mentioned that like they could have different tasks. They just basically have no way of no power and no way of getting any sort of influence or power. But like you could come across, your party could come across like a male drow who's been sent to the surface to say find more slaves for one of the Lowell civilizations. And so you come across, you're ambushed by, say, a group of drow, and there's a male drow that's leading this party, and they're trying to capture you to bring you down to become slaves in the Underdark. And they have just this whole different perception on everything, because obviously you're going to, stop them, capture them, and talk to them.
Yeah.
You're not just going to murder them all of them, be like, oh, those are male drow. And someone might roll a good religion check to know, hey, that's uncommon.
Yeah, that's uncommon.
Yeah.
And then if you do get dragged down to the Underdark, you know who you need to talk to, and it's not this guy.
Yeah, exactly. Because yeah, he reports to some priestess, and so like so much opportunity to, depending on what the party does and the players do, to drop different pieces of drow, and it might end up taking a side quest for many a month, or it
Yeah.
might just be this little nugget of an encounter where you end up killing them, and it's like, huh, that's weird, and then you move on.
So good. Hilarious. All right. Well, that's it for the generalized drow. So now we're going to lead into talking about some of the other options and some of the other options. Ehlwyn, take it away.
Yeah, so just a quick side note before we dig into Drizzt and the Renegades. As much as the series is going to dig into the lore of Drow, it is worth pointing out that these rules are often broken for player characters. So that was just a little note from our wonderful Adam. As we've sort of covered, Drow society is quite the paradox, being both extremely oppressive and extremely open-ended. All Drow have the opportunity to better their life and societal standing, but it comes at a cost and a struggle. Those at the top don't want to relinquish their power, while those at the bottom are constantly vying for more status. Obviously, those who hold the power view this as a threat that often only has three outcomes for those that go against them. Enslavement, death, or for the rare lucky ones, they reject the Drow society altogether, escaping the Underdark and becoming a nomad and outcast. The survival of a nomadic Drow in the Underdark is nearly impossible. The Drow societies are far-reaching, and the main routes are covered with guard posts. So, out of survival instinct, these Drows often flee to the surface, but only a small few make it up there in the end. The Drow Renegades refers to this group of Drow who reject the cruel and treacherous ways of their society, seeking redemption and a new path. One of the more notable Drow Renegades is Drizzt Ehlwyn. This rebellious drow with a heart of gold has become an incredibly popular trope in D&D. Drizzt is typically described as having dark skin, white hair, and striking violet eyes, which is uncommon amongst the drow. He is often depicted wearing black hooded cloak, leather armor, and dual-wielding scimitars. Usually his iconic blades twinkle and icing death, as well as being known for possessing the figurine of wondrous power that allows him to summon his Black Panther companion, Gwenwiver. He is known for his intelligence, agility, and profound sense of honor. I would also say humor as well. He often grapples with the prejudice against the Drow and seeks to defy the violent, treacherous nature of his people. His deep moral compass leads him to protect the innocent and fight against evil alongside friends like Wolfgar, Catti Bree, and Bruenor Battlehammer. Drizzt didn't have an easy upbringing in Underdark, despite being born into the rather prestigious House of Do'Uldren, which at the time of its collapse was the 8th house of the city of Menzoberranzan, commonly known as the City of Spiders. After his house fell, his father being sacrificed to Lolth, and an encounter with 2 rivals that led to both their deaths, Drizzt escaped the Drow society and its endless killing cycle, choosing to wander the Underdark as a rogue for 10 years before venturing to the surface, where his story only just begins. There is a lot of lore about this guy. He was initially introduced into D&D in 1988.
Yeah.
And has only evolved from there. This is only like a surface scratch of his kind of lore. I could have talked for hours about this guy. He is one of my favorites.
Yeah, I think because I way back in the day used to read every once in a while like an R.A. Salvatore book, and one of them is of Drizzt, and like
he's got an entire series on him.
Yeah, and like just Google him, you're like, that's a nice looking drow, you know?
Oh yeah, it's Daddy Drizzt. It's 100%.
I feel like we had to find something to hypersexualize, and I think we found it.
Oh yeah.
100%. No, yeah, he's always been one of my favorites. He's commonly portrayed in a lot of video games. Like he is in the first 2 Baldur's, like he's in almost all of the Baldur's Gates except for Baldur's Gate 3. He's in, he's kind of a pinnacle character in Into the Abyss. You meet him. He's scattered and kind of dotted throughout a lot to do with D&D 5e, or just D&D in general. And I think, it's kind of obvious why he's kind of become so popular as a trope, because he is kind of, we were talking about the heroes that go against Lolth and that kind of reject the Drow society. He is kind of their poster boy.
That's what I mean. And I feel like he's the poster boy for the male society, you know?
Yeah, as well, yes.
So I just have to point that out, is the fact that the one's like surviving rebel of this whole thing that they've focused in on, it's a man.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I guess he had to bring balance somehow. But a question to ask you guys then, does being a rebel from your own species interest you as a player? So even if we're talking like Drow or what have you, is that a trope that you're interested in? No need to roll dice, just like what are you guys' thoughts?
Yes, always.
Always, yeah? You'll do it?
Always. I have always, maybe this just speaks to my own personal, I've always liked challenging social norms. And so growing up in, if you have a character that grows up in, a very structured society, I would definitely be that type that was like, I'm sorry, I'm female and you want me to, be a housewife and, a mother and this. I'm like, no, I'm gonna go join the boys and like go be an archer, or like go, like I've always kind of been that kind of person. So I think I tend to bring those notes into players or like characters that I've played before.
Yeah.
So yes, it would definitely be a rebel.
Yeah, there is a lot of intrigue in terms of like going against what you were supposed to do, right? Like I think that's just ingrained in us as human beings, that like if you get told you can't do it, you're probably gonna do it, like I think that's just it's the way I inspire myself, you know what I mean, as a person. So in game, I think that's a lot of fun to play with, right? Like tell me I can't do something. Like Adam thinks that I can't play a monk like a barbarian, and here I am doing it. You know what I mean? So so yeah, I do like the idea of going against like your own histories, right? It's kind of like that whole thing of like I'm going to pave my own path, which weirdly enough comes back to like Lolth as a whole. Is she wants to pave her own path. So like of course the people that she breeds and raises in her culture, of course, is going to be very ingrained to go against what they're told, because they've been taught that that's what gives you strength, right? That's what gives you learning, and that's what gives you growth, right?
And I think that that's where that paradox comes from, is you're always encouraged to better yourself and to grow and to rise in society, but then there's also the oppression of the society of there can only be one high power, and Lolth is one high power, and that's why she's always feeling threatened about.
No, for sure. Yeah. What about you, Casey? Any thoughts on that one?
Well, in my own life, I am very aware that I am a rule follower, and I have been my whole life. So I would not go down this in D&D, especially when I was just learning. I was like, okay, I need to know the rules in and out, and this is my backstory, this is my family history. Okay, I am like in alignment.
Yeah. And if I look at the
12-page
characters
essay.
you've built, yeah, like you have
12-page essay delivered to your DM of like everything.
Yeah. And if I think of the characters I've played with Casey at the table, they are very, I know my history, I know who I am, I know what my goals are, this is what I am doing. Like, it is very cut and dry, follows her own rules. And to be honest with you, that's a great player that does that, right?
100%.
Like, it's, and because as a DM, it sometimes makes it a little bit easier because you can use the lore as written to help guide that character in the direction that you want to go. Then you get like the one-off shoot characters that like Ehlwyn and I make, where we're just like, I'm going to go against everything I was learning and I'm going to do whatever I want, right? And the GM's like, okay, where are we going with this? Like,
pure chaos.
Absolute chaos.
Because we also have Charlie at our table, who decides to create all of his own shit and combine 5 different things into one thing because it's cool as fuck.
Yes.
And Adam just embraces that as well. But then it's like, okay, thank you, Casey, for just being a Loxodon cleric.
Yeah. No, it's like, and again, like the first campaign, I did the same thing as you, Casey. In the first campaign I played with you guys, what was I? A human paladin, for fuck's sakes. Like, I went as cut dry, I know what I want direction, right? And then it was Adam's trauma that made me change what my character was doing.
Mm-hmm.
But I very much started that campaign as a rule follower because I was learning the table, I was learning you folks as players. I didn't want to be over the top, like center of attention, figure my shit out character. I really just wanted to fit in.
Yeah.
So, but now that I'm more learned and we played so many years together, I'm happy to go against the cuff now. You know what I mean? So
yeah. And I think now that well, at least with 5th edition, I feel really confident in my knowledge about, and I know a lot more, especially from being a part of It's a Mimic.
Yeah.
I would be more inclined to entertain the idea of being a rebel. But yeah, it's not as natural to me.
No, but you're doing great.
I think that that's just kind of the beauty of, characters that you create is it's 50% the rules and the understanding of the game and, the created lore it's presented to you, and 50% who you are as a person and kind of the boundaries that you want to push. And, it's why improv is always like so great for D&D players and things like that, is because it helps us kind of break out of kind of our comfort zones and things like that. And so it's something that I always like to challenge myself to do. I personally find like it very difficult to play like paladins or clerics or, those that have discipline, because I don't have a lot of like that type of discipline in my life. And so I find it very challenging. And so I always tend to like almost lean towards challenging myself with those characters instead of the ones that are like the rebels or like the pure chaos murder hobos.
I just think you build ADHD characters is what you do.
I do. I really do. That is very true. I do build ADHD characters because that is my comfort zone.
It's your rogues, it's your rangers, it's your just chaotic ADHD characters.
Yeah, it's it's the barbarian druids multi-class. It's the, it's just
Charlie and Ehlwyn like need to sit together when they make their characters, because I feel like they have very
Dan
similar
needs
energy.
to be in there as well. Like, I feel like Dan, Charlie, and I would just
make the weirdest asinine character on the planet.
A, that, but B, like, I think we might give Adam an aneurysm.
Correct.
If we're at the same table together.
100%.
You would come up with characters for the next decade that you can play.
I do. And like, I mean, I have made some of my favorite characters are just like the most out there. Like, I don't make straight laced characters anymore.
No.
I try and push those boundaries of how chaotic can we get. And I don't know, I might switch it up and challenge myself to
well,
straight laced.
I like the beauty of a simplicity, like a simple character at the beginning, because then I can take it anywhere I want to go. Like we didn't think with my core character, my paladin of light ended up being a dark knight in the end, you know what I mean? But like that journey that I took her on from beginning to end for a 3-year fucking campaign probably never would have happened if I didn't go in with a straight-laced human paladin, right?
Yeah.
Like, it just gives so much room for opportunity. and you're not pigeonholing yourself into like having to have a very specific response to something.
Yeah.
Like there was like there was scenes in that campaign, like there was the campaign that we played in Ehlwyn way back, where I played a super like straight-laced cleric basically.
Cleric, yeah.
And we ended up in a torture scene, and my character lost her mind and said, "This is absolutely the dumbest thing I've ever seen," and like walked away. And like the DM at the time was like, "Why is your character so upset?" I'm like, "I'm sorry. I am a cleric of healing, and you just put me in a torture scene. Of course she's gonna walk away, you idiot." Like,
well, and I was literally thinking of that campaign of like, I had started out that campaign as a bard, and like I had gone in it with like the sole intent to like panel my inner Sam Riegel and Scanlan of just bringing fun to the table and just comedy and lightheartedness. And then that DM, through some emotional trauma my way, ended up multi-classing into warlock. He like left the party for a while because she was like, I don't know who I am anymore, and like just absolutely spiraled me into darkness. And I was like, well, I'm like, there goes my lightheartedness. I did chaos, just
it was an
dark
emotional
chaos.
campaign. Like as people, that was an emotional campaign. Yeah.
Very, yeah.
Anyways, I think we're all agreeing here that there's room for playing a rebel of your own species, like especially when it comes to the Drow, because I think that's going to give you a lot of opportunities to have different types of storylines, right? Instead of just being a straight-laced Drow, I just live in the Underdark and I'm never leaving. Like you kind of have to have that little like understanding that you might have to be a rebel to actually be able to play in a campaign, right? I think it's ingrained in the Drow that you almost have to do that. Unless you're playing in a Drow campaign, right?
Yeah,
so,
you're either going to be cut and dry loyalist, or you're going to be a rebel.
Yeah, and I will say some people are intrigued by, well, I guess it stems from L5R, the having something negative in your repertoire for who you are, like sensitivity to light. Some people, like my partner, actually brought this more to front of mind to me, because I'm like, I would never do that. And he's like,
how annoying.
He builds characters to have some sort of disadvantage, like I forget what they're called in L5R.
Disadvantages.
Oh, they are.
So you have advantages and you have disadvantages.
Right.
So,
and so you can gain both, and then you have to just work with both of those as you carry yourself as the character. And so, like, my partner would probably gravitate towards playing a Drow because of that disadvantage around sunlight. And he would be like, I'll roll with it. I will figure it out. I will accept that I roll with disadvantage when we're fighting during the day. But I will be constantly asking the DM if the sun is out.
Right? Like, and to the point where I feel like the DM at some point would just be like, all right, everybody roll for initiative. It is sunny outside.
Yeah. You would just build it in.
Yeah.
But yeah, like regardless of whether you choose to play a rebel style Drow or just like you're playing a Drow, it's also okay to embrace the disadvantage that comes with Drow, because that is one of the very, very few things that have that, or very, very few like races that have that in D&D 5th edition. So it's a good one. And it's just that link to where I saw it for the first time in L5R. So
yeah, because it's built into the character development. Like it's on your sheet that you have a disadvantage in XYZ. Yeah. And I tend to now, when I do D&D characters, because I played L5R for quite some time, if I build a D&D character, I will usually just build in my own little disad. Just like, and it's more for me from a role-playing perspective, not from a stat perspective, right? Mm-hmm. So
I would never do that.
And it doesn't have to be anything crippling. Like it can just be something like you're addicted to gambling. Yeah. Or like just something that gives your character something to do when things are in downtime. Like everybody always asks, well, what are you doing right now? And it's like, oh, I took out my deck of cards and I'm play gambling with myself, right? Like, so anyways. Anywho, so before we wrap up this episode, we are going to start talking about a couple of our minions.
Yeah, so we can't really go too far into Drow without talking about spiders. So Megan, you're so happy. So happy about this.
The best day of my life.
We do get a stat block and a stat block for spider, just a straight up spider in the monster manual. It's included in the miscellaneous creatures section at the back of the book. And the spider is a tiny beast. It's unaligned. It's AC of 12. hit point average of 1. It has a speed of 20 feet and a climbing speed of 20 feet. Skilled in stealth with a +4. Dex is their only above average ability score. They have dark vision of 30 feet and a passive perception of 10. Spiders don't speak languages. It just makes sense. They're a beast. And they are a CR of 0. So not surprising, they can spider climb. They can walk on webs without restriction, and they have web sense, which means they know the exact location of any other creature in contact with that same web. So remember when I talked about the Drow cities being cloaked with webbing and webbing through the air? Yeah, like this, you do not penetrate that fortress because every spider on that web will know the second that you do. And their only action is a bite melee attack, which is on one creature, and it will deal 1 piercing damage on a hit, and the target must make a DC 9 con save or also take 1d4 poison damage. So these are really, really easy to introduce, as you know, maybe a few of them in your campaign at a very, very low level. They're creepy, they're crawly. They can do a bit of damage, but CR of 0. So.
Yeah, if you're exploring the Underdark or getting anywhere near Drow, you're going to come across a spider. So it's just going to happen.
Yeah.
So next up is a swarm of insects, and in the monsters manual, there's a variant for swarm of spiders. So swarm of.
Sorry, I'll
saw
let you
your
continue.
Face on camera. And it's just. So swarm of insects, quite a common spell that most of us should be familiar with. So it's a medium swarm of tiny beasts. They're unaligned. They have an AC of 12, 22 hit points, a speed of 20, and a climb of 20 feet as well. Their only stat that is above average is a +1 to their dex. They are resistant to bludgeoning, piercing, slashing. Their condition immunities are charmed, frightened, paralyzed, petrified, prone, restrained, stunned. They've got blind sight of 10 feet and a passive perception of 8. They have a CR of 1/2.
Cute.
Insect Swarm has the ability Swarm, where they can occupy another creature's space and vice versa, and the swarm can move through any opening large enough for a tiny insect. The swarm can't regain hit points or gain temporary hit points. It's got an action, so its actions are bite, so it's a melee weapon attack of +3 to hit. It's got a 0-foot reach, 1 target in the swarm space. It's a 10 points of piercing damage or 5 points of piercing damage if the swarm has half of its hit points or fewer. So the swarm of spiders variant gives these additional traits. So it has spider climb. So the swarm can climb difficult surfaces, including upside down on ceilings without needing to make an ability check. Has web sense. While in contact with web, the swarm knows the exact location of any other creature. And then it has web walker. The swarm ignores movement restrictions caused by webbing. So very similar to the spider minion or the spider. A little less buffy than an actual spider, but you got a bunch of them.
Yeah.
So
makes sense.
Yeah.
Much more intimidating and can do a bit more damage. Still not wildly terrifying, but
it's like how when we did the undead episodes, we're just constantly like, oh, one of them isn't scary, but when you put 10 of them in a room, I'm not about it. You know? Like, That's it, guys. It's the point. All right, let's raise some dice one last time. I got a question for these guys. All right.
Oh my God, Nat 20.
Look at you.
What's happened?
I got an 8.
I rolled a 9.
Nice. All right, so Casey, you're up first. What's one interesting or unique way that you would use these minions in your Drow campaigns?
In a Drow campaign, I would have these as like like doormen, so not guards, but they are the ones that swoop up in front of you. And I'm thinking like in Finding Dory, where there's like the swarm of fish that give the directions.
Yeah, I'm also now imagining with top hats because you called them doormen. So
makes them a little less frightening.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm thinking like there's just these swarms of spiders that move around everywhere. Like they are common. They're just like, livestock moving about like a farm. They are everywhere, but their responsibility is to like direct people from the door to where they need to go. And so when you enter, if you are allowed to enter, they will be the ones to greet you, and they will make sure you follow the direction. And so they will lead you to where you're going to go. And if you deviate or you try to attack them, they can obviously defend themselves. And they will probably recruit more swarms of spiders to come to their aid, because there will be webs everywhere, and they will be able to just like go, hey, we need backup on aisle 10, So I would use them in that way, just to integrate them into more of the city. If you're entering a city, that's of Drow and Underdark.
Yeah. I would also say, like, if you are playing them as an NPC, as a player, I would be like, I just have spiders around me all the time, or they're just in my hair, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Or if you're the DM and you have Drow in your campaign, there would just be spiders all over the place all the time. And they're just friendly, so they're just hanging out, doing their thing, like living their best life. But this just has to be said that there's spiders everywhere, kind of thing. So like you wake up in the morning and like your whole campsite is just covered in webs. Like, but it's a protection thing, right? Like, can you imagine like at nighttime when you're like, okay, everybody, like, let's set up camp. You're like, okay, spiders, go set up this nice web around us, and then let me know if anything comes in, right?
Yeah, like imagine that was just inspired me of like what flavor you could bring to casting alarm, because alarm is super kind of boring.
Yeah,
it's
alarm
very
is boring,
but it's just like, I cast alarm, all right, cool.
You bore me. Yeah,
but yeah, that flavor of my casting alarm is then like my spiders go and they make a web around us, so that is what is the ult setting off the alarm is touching those webs. That's cute.
That's really cool. Yeah. I was thinking that these are gonna be Lulk's watchdogs, like
spies.
They are gonna be her spies. They are gonna be, they are camped out everywhere, and they are reporting back to her.
Love it.
Or like, she's a god. She can see through them as well. So like, she's using them as like her security system. She's observing through them, and she's listening through them, and she knows all that's going on. And I think that it kind of adds some layers of, it supports her paranoia of like people trying to rise up against her, and her constant need to know what's going on, and her desire to always be kind of one step ahead of everybody. That's kind of the way that I was seeing these, is all of these places are just covered with webs, and she's the spider queen, and they're gonna report right back to her. And actually, you can have your NPC, if you have the opposite of what I said, if you have an NPC, if they see a spider, they panic. Yeah. Because they're like, nope, like that's like, must kill that immediately, or else Lulf is going to know where I am and what I'm doing, right? Especially if you're being a rebel or a renegade and you've escaped the Underdark. She's going to go looking for you, or someone in your family is going to go looking for you. They're going to use these spiders to find you. Yeah. And so that would be a good trope, that if you just have a fear of spiders, but it's because you don't want to be watched. And I feel like you could flavor it in a way that like these, like her specific watchdog spiders look like have a certain aesthetic to them. So, they could, look more like black widows, but they've got kind of like a purple hue to them, or something along those lines, something that kind of flavors to kind of the Drow aesthetic, so that they're a little bit more identifiable, because there's spiders everywhere. And I think it would be a stretch to say that every spider reports back to Lulf, but she does have kind of these spiders that are out there and kind of doing her bidding and doing her watching for her.
Love it. Yeah, that's so good.
Megan?
But
oh, I guess you already answered, didn't you?
I did.
Okay. You went before me because you were supposed to go after me. Okay. So any final thoughts, inspirations, anything? I think we covered a lot of lore on Drow. Yeah, it's a good start. Like in some of the reading, I know we're going to be covering a lot going into the next couple like episodes, but like that was a very brief taste of some of the stuff that we're going to be reviewing. So
But it's a good starting point. Like to Casey's point, it's a good place to build a character that even if you don't know all of the lore or the history, it's going to be built one way, but then there's a lot of opportunity to educate and teach your player as it grows and so on and so forth, right? So I think that if you're going to DM with Drow, you need to read about them. It's not just as simple as an elf and everybody knows what an elf is. Like this is a little bit more complex and a little bit more of the history. Like people are going to respond and react to Drow differently than they will a Loxodon or what have you, right? So do your research if you're going to have Drow in your campaigns, or do a Drow campaign. You will want to do your research. So
yeah, I would say that, and I would say, you know, be mindful of, you know, what Adam and Mieka cover in, you know, episode 0 as well. They bring up a lot of really good points. That when doing a Drow campaign, it's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Agreed. Well, that's all for the introduction of Drow in D&D 5th edition. Please take a second to engage with a like, follow, comment, and review to help push our engagement. And don't forget to subscribe to find future inspirations for your campaigns.
If you'd like to support us, we have a store with some merch and a donate button on our website, it'samimic.com, as well as a Patreon. This episode and others can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and most other podcast apps. Thanks for listening to It's a Mimic, where you never know what you're going to get. Thank you.